Yeah, can we please have Gabe start? Bye.
Welcome back to Neo SoulHouse, where we uncover the untold stories behind soul music's most influential artists and the movements that changed everything. Today, we're diving deep into one of music's most mysterious and powerful collectives, a group whose impact you hear in every experimental R&B track today, but whose real story has remained hidden in the shadows of Electric Lady Studios. If you're new here, you're about to discover why the music you love sounds the way it does. And if you've been with us from the beginning, this one's going to blow your mind. Let's get into it. The revolution nobody saw coming. In the late 1990s, something extraordinary was happening in a dimly lit studio in Greenwich Village. While the mainstream music industry was pumping out formulaic hits, a group of musicians were quietly revolutionizing the sound of black music in ways that would influence everything that came after. They called themselves the Soulquarians, and at the center of this creative storm was Erykah Badu, whose presence would both elevate and complicate everything the collective touched. Electric Lady Studios had seen legends before. Jimi Hendrix built it, Stevie Wonder lived in it. But what happened there between 1997 and 2002 was different. This wasn't just about making albums. This was about a group of young black artists creating a new musical language. And the story of how it all fell apart is one that most fans have never heard. The Soulquarians weren't just a collective, they were a family. And like most families, they had secrets, tensions, and breaking points that would eventually tear them apart. What started as informal jam sessions between Questlove and D'Angelo would grow into something that included James Poyser, J Dilla, Common, Mos Def, Talib Kweli, and at the heart of it all, Erykah Badu. But the woman who helped define their sound would also become one of the reasons the group couldn't stay together. And the truth about what really happened in those studios has remained largely untold until now. When genius minds collide. The formation of the Soulquarians wasn't planned. It was organic, almost spiritual, the way Questlove tells it. He and D'Angelo had been working on what would become Voodoo, spending 18-hour days in the studio, when other artists started gravitating toward their sessions. James Poyser would drop by with new chord progressions that seemed to come from another dimension. Then J Dilla would appear with beats that defied everything hip-hop was supposed to be. These weren't just musicians, they were sonic architects rebuilding R&B from the ground up. But everything shifted when Erykah Badu entered the picture in 1998. She wasn't just another vocalist looking for beats. Badu brought an energy that was both nurturing and challenging. She'd walk into sessions wearing head wraps and burning incense, turning the studio into something that felt more like a spiritual sanctuary than a workplace. Questlove later admitted that her presence made everyone step up their game. You couldn't bring anything basic around Badu. She'd look at you with those eyes and you'd know immediately if your contribution wasn't up to standard. The unspoken rules of the collective began forming around this time. No outside producers unless unanimously approved. No commercial pressure talk during creative time. And most importantly, everyone checks their ego at the door. That last rule would prove the hardest to maintain. The studio became their universe, with sessions starting at midnight and ending when the sun was high. They'd order soul food from Sylvia's, discuss Coltrane and Clinton, and create music that sounded like nothing else on the radio. What made them different wasn't just talent. Every member brought something essential. Questlove was the historian and rhythm keeper. D'Angelo was the perfectionist who'd spend 3 hours on a single ad-lib. Common brought the street poetry. Dilla had beats that seemed to breathe, and Badu? She was the spiritual center, the one who could take all these elements and make them feel like they belonged together. But that same spiritual intensity that unified them would eventually become a source of division. The Mama's Gun sessions that changed everything. When Badu began recording Mama's Gun in 1999, the Soulquarians were at their creative peak, but behind the scenes, cracks were starting to show. The album should have been a celebration of the collective's power, but instead it became a pressure cooker of creative tension. Dilla was crafting beats that were so complex, so ahead of their time, that even some members of the group didn't understand them at first. His work on tracks like Didn't Ya Know was revolutionary, but it was also divisive. The problem wasn't just creative differences, it was about recognition and credit. While the collective emphasized group effort, the reality was that Badu's star was rising faster than anyone else's. She was becoming the face of Neo Soul, and some members felt like they were becoming her backing band rather than equal collaborators. There were heated discussions about production credits, about whose name appeared where, and about who was really driving the sound that critics were praising. One particular night in October 1999 became legendary among those who were there. Badu and Dilla had been working on a track for 14 hours straight, and tensions exploded when she wanted to completely restructure a beat he'd spent weeks perfecting. The argument got so intense that Questlove had to physically separate them. But here's what most people don't know. They went right back to work an hour later, and that tension created Green Eyes, one of the most emotionally raw tracks on the album. The sessions revealed something crucial about the collective's dynamic. They needed conflict to create their best work, but that same conflict was slowly poisoning their relationships. Badu's perfectionism matched D'Angelo's, which meant sessions could stretch for days on a single song. Engineers would fall asleep at the board. Pizza boxes would pile up in corners. And through it all, they were creating music that would influence a generation, even as they were barely speaking to each other by the end of some sessions. Love, music, and complicated relationships. The romantic entanglements within the Soulquarians added another layer of complexity that most fans never fully understood. D'Angelo and Badu's connection went beyond music. They had a chemistry that was obvious to anyone in the room, but it was also complicated by the fact that both were in different places in their lives. D'Angelo was spiraling into the perfectionism that would later derail his career, while Badu was embracing a spiritual journey that not everyone understood. Then, Common entered the picture, and his relationship with Badu from 2000 to 2002 changed the entire dynamic of the group. Suddenly, there were unspoken tensions in the studio. D'Angelo would leave sessions when Common arrived. Common's Like Water for Chocolate album, which should have been a triumphant Soulquarians collaboration, became a minefield of personal dynamics. The love triangle wasn't just tabloid fodder, it was affecting the music in real, tangible ways. What made it more complicated was that the music they were creating during this period was some of their best work. Common's The Light, which was essentially a love letter to Badu, became one of the collective's biggest mainstream successes. But behind that success was D'Angelo, who had to watch his creative partner and complicated love interest inspire someone else's art. Questlove later described it as watching a slow-motion car crash while simultaneously creating beautiful music. The personal dynamics started affecting professional decisions. Sessions would be scheduled around who was dating whom. Certain collaborations became impossible because of personal history. The collective that had prided itself on checking egos at the door was now navigating a maze of personal relationships that made every creative decision fraught with emotional subtext. And Badu, whether intentionally or not, was at the center of it all, her presence both inspiring and dividing the group in equal measure. If you're feeling this deep dive into the Soulquarians story, hit that like button right now. It really helps push these untold stories to more soul music lovers who need to hear them. And if you haven't subscribed to Neo SoulHouse yet, what are you waiting for? We drop new stories about the artists and movements that shaped soul, R&B, and hip-hop every week. Hit subscribe and that notification bell so you never miss the real stories behind the music. All right, let's get back to what really ended the Soulquarians and why they could never reunite. The peak that couldn't last. By 2001, the Soulquarians had reached a level of influence that seemed unstoppable. They had helped create classic albums for D'Angelo, Common, Badu, and The Roots. Critics were calling them the most important musical collective since Parliament Funkadelic. But success was pulling them in different directions. And the very thing that made them special, their refusal to compromise, was making it impossible to stay together. The touring schedules alone were becoming a nightmare. Badu was headlining festivals around the world. The Roots had their own obligations. D'Angelo's Voodoo tour was both a triumph and a disaster, with his perfectionism and personal struggles making every show a potential crisis. The studio that had been their sanctuary was now empty more often than it was full. When they did manage to get together, the old magic was harder to capture. Everyone was a star now, and stars have entourages, managers, and obligations that don't care about collective creativity. There was also the financial reality that no one wanted to discuss. While they were creating groundbreaking art, the music industry was changing. Album sales were declining, and the experimental Neo Soul that the Soulquarians pioneered wasn't as commercially viable as the more mainstream R&B that was dominating radio. Labels were putting pressure on everyone to create hits, not art. The very foundation of what the collective stood for was being challenged by market forces they couldn't control. The last full Soulquarian session happened in early 2002, though no one knew it would be the last at the time. They were supposed to be working on material for various projects, but the session devolved into arguments about direction, about credit, about everything they'd managed to avoid discussing for years. Badu left early, saying she had a spiritual advisor to see. D'Angelo disappeared for 3 days afterward. Common was already working with other producers. The family was dissolving, and everyone could feel it, but no one wanted to admit it. The Dissolution and Its Aftermath. The Soulquarians never officially broke up. They just stopped showing up. By the end of 2002, Electric Lady studio sessions that once ran until sunrise were replaced by empty rooms and echoes of what had been. D'Angelo retreated into an isolation that would last nearly 15 years. Dilla moved to Los Angeles, where he'd continue revolutionizing hip-hop until his death in 2006. Badu continued evolving her sound, but now she was doing it alone, or with different collaborators who didn't challenge her the way the Soulquarians had. What killed the collective wasn't one thing, but a combination of factors that built up over time. The pressure of creating revolutionary art while dealing with industry demands. The personal relationships that complicated professional ones. The success that pulled everyone in different directions. And perhaps most importantly, the fact that what they had created was so perfect in its moment that trying to recreate it would have been a betrayal of what made it special in the first place. Questlove, who perhaps more than anyone tried to keep the collective together, later admitted that the Soulquarians were like lightning in a bottle. You can't schedule lightning, you can't manage it or market it, it just happens. And when it's over, all you can do is appreciate that you were there when it struck. He still keeps in touch with most members, but he's also realistic about why they can't go back. Too much has happened. Too much has changed. The influence of the Soulquarians can be heard in everything from Kendrick Lamar's jazz-influenced productions to Anderson .Paak's fusion of soul and hip-hop. Artists like Robert Glasper, Terrace Martin, and Thundercat are carrying forward the experimental spirit that the collective pioneered. But they're doing it in their own way, because that's what the Soulquarians would have wanted. They never wanted to create a formula. They wanted to inspire others to break their own rules. Recent revelations and the real story. In recent years, members of the collective have started opening up about what really happened during those intense years. Common revealed in his memoir that the pressure of living up to the Soulquarians standard nearly drove him to quit music altogether. He described sessions where they'd work for 20 hours straight, fueled by nothing but creativity and the fear of creating something ordinary. The physical and mental toll was real, even if the music made it seem effortless. Badu has been perhaps the most candid about the collective's dynamics. In a 2019 interview, she admitted that being the primary female voice in such a male-dominated space was both empowering and exhausting. She felt a responsibility to represent feminine energy in a way that was authentic, but also had to constantly prove that her contributions were just as vital as any beat or rhythm. The spiritual mother role that everyone assigned to her was both a blessing and a burden that she's still processing years later. The most surprising revelations have come from studio engineers and assistants who witnessed everything but were sworn to secrecy until recently. They describe scenes of creative genius mixed with personal drama that would make a compelling documentary. There was the night D'Angelo destroyed an entire mixing board because he couldn't get a snare sound right. The session where Dilla created 3 classic beats in an hour because Badu said she needed something that sounded like purple rain falling on Mars. The time Common and D'Angelo nearly came to blows over a chord progression that both claimed to have written. But perhaps the most telling revelation is that despite all the drama, all the tension, and all the pain, every single member considers the Soulquarians period the most creatively fulfilling time of their lives. They might not be able to recreate it, but they also wouldn't change it. The collective had to burn bright and burn out because that's what made the music so powerful. It was the sound of artists pushing themselves and each other beyond what was comfortable, beyond what was safe, and creating something that still sounds like the future 20 years later. The legacy that lives on. The truth about the Soulquarians is that they succeeded in their ultimate goal, even if they didn't realize it at the time. They wanted to change music, to prove that Black artistry didn't have to fit into industry-created boxes, and they did exactly that. Every artist who refuses to compromise their vision for commercial success is carrying on the Soulquarians' legacy. Every producer who spends weeks perfecting a single beat that might not even make the album is channeling Dilla's spirit. Every singer who brings spiritual energy into the studio is following Badu's blueprint. What's remarkable is that there's never been a successful attempt to recreate what the Soulquarians had. Others have tried to form similar collectives, but they've either been too calculated or too loose, too commercial or too experimental. The Soulquarians existed in a perfect storm of talent, timing, and creative tension that can't be manufactured. It had to happen organically, and it had to end when it did, because extending it would have turned it into something else entirely. Today, the members rarely discuss reuniting, and when they do, it's with the understanding that it wouldn't be the same. They're different people now, with different perspectives and different goals. Badu continues to push boundaries in her own way. Questlove has become a cultural historian and tastemaker. Common is an actor and activist. They've all evolved beyond what the collective was, but they've also carried its spirit into everything they do. The untold story of Erykah Badu and the Soulquarians isn't really about the drama or the relationships or even the incredible music they created. It's about what happens when artists decide that creating something meaningful is more important than creating something marketable. It's about the price of that decision and the beauty that comes from paying it. The Soulquarians didn't just make albums. They created a moment in time that changed music forever. And sometimes that's all any artist can hope to do.